Morning. How's everyone doing?
Hey, everyone.
All right. It's really good to have you here, Nick, today. It's been quite a ride since we first started working with you. Just to set a little bit of context for the audience, we at December started working with Nick, I believe, back in early 2017, while Nick was heading the engineering team at Reddit. And since then, we've been able to partner. And then I believe Nick has gone through some wonderful ride at Looker. Congratulations again. And then now at Twitter. So I believe that today's topic is around how do we create a high-performing and a diverse team? And we'd love to kind of hear from you some of the insights that you that we can get from some of the experience you've had for the years. So let me start with the first question. But before I start, if you have anything you want to share with the audience today, Nick.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I was just ready to jump into the questions, but yeah, no, happy to be here. And for those in the audience who don't know, I've actually known John for several years now. He was his company worked really closely with Reddit to get their chat system, and I was just super impressed with him. So I'm glad now you're interviewing me. So I'm honored. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we're really living in this interesting and challenging time right now. The world experiencing the biggest pandemic ever in our generation. The vast majority of tech people working from home and remotely. Political environment is pretty divided than ever, and there's a lot of racial injustice that has been really brought to the surface. So kind of with this context in mind, let's first start by defining what a diverse team means for product and engineering. So how would you define a diverse team? What are the characteristics that you look for or not look for in such a team?
Yeah, you touched on a super heavy point. So before I jump into the more specifics around how we define diverse teams, just for leaders who are aware of what's going on in the world right now with respect to Black Lives Matter and other sorts of social change. You should pay attention to that. That supersedes anything I'm about to tell you about the generic answers around building diverse teams. There's been a lot of news week over week within that regard. That if you're unaware of it right now, just pop open Google or anything. Particularly your Black employees are hurting right now. Now, to get to the specific questions about how I define diverse teams, and you guys should know. I don't know if you guys are familiar with me, but I tend to approach these sorts of conversations in an incredibly practical manner. I want you to walk away from, or I guess not walk, this is virtual. I want you to come away from this with really useful ideas that you can bring back to your team. So the general definition of how I define a diverse team is, look, we want a place that has varying gender, race, religion, ethnicity, awareness of veteran status, sexual orientation, all of those sorts of things. People who are in those various categories need to feel comfortable and accepted in an environment that we create for them to work in. And in order to do that, I think we can approach this systemically. And the way I think about diverse organizations, not just teams, is that there are systems in place to build empathy, so that managers and leaders and the general population within your company empathizes with concerns related to inclusion and diversity. And once you have empathy, we can then move on toward application of techniques that allow us to build a diverse pipeline, retain candidates who accept offers, and then we grow those folks once they're within the walls. So, for me, a diverse team covers not just the specifics of saying that we need inclusion and gender and ethnicity, but that systems are in place to reinforce with action all of the goals implied by diversity and inclusion efforts. Leadership has to be bought in. Funding for employee resource groups and so forth should come from the company budget, not from the volunteer efforts of people within the employee base. And ideally, metrics should exist to track progress amongst all of the above. If a sales leader doesn't hit his targets, we get a different sales leader. By the same token, I think we need metrics that we can hold all executives accountable to related to inclusion and diversity. So I hope that gets at it, John.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you mentioned a couple of really interesting keywords. So one is like practical. How do we approach this systematically and practically, and really kind of build that pipeline of diverse candidates? And especially for someone like us, we went from whatever 20, 30 people to about 200 people plus in the past couple of years. Especially early stage of startup, it's really hard to build a strong yet diverse team, because as most people in the early days come through like referrals and word of mouth from your existing network. So what are some of the ways we can actually build candidate pipeline that meets these kind of criteria of really building a diverse team?
Oh, for sure. Actually, someone in the chat just said, asked a follow-on question, which is related to this, which they asked about how to build systems for empathy. So let me start with that and then lead into, you can't do any of what I'm about to say without having empathy. Thank you, Jen. So one system that I think works really well for building empathy so that your employees actually believe that this matters is exposure. Like empathy comes from exposure. Like, so for Reddit, when I was there, I remember a moment in time when we actually invited some folks from a boot camp into our offices so that our managers could mentor them, teach them Python and things like that. And I remember that being more effective than any sort of training that we had ever done related to diversity and inclusion. Because our managers got to know these people one-on-one basis, understand their story, their track records, the difficulties that they were building. So the number one thing I would encourage you before you go hire like a chief diversity officer or go put people through a bunch of unconscious bias training, you can do all that stuff. That has some value to it, but the highest order bit, I think, is exposure, right? Like get people in front of folks and get them to just talk and understand, like build that empathy. So John had asked about, hey, it's like I know all the people in the chat. This is cool. John had asked about specifically building a pipeline for startups. There's a couple different things that I would recommend, not just for startups, really for any stage company. These approaches will work. The first is I strongly encourage everyone in every stage company, not just startups, to consider new pathways into technology. And just take a moment and just be honest with yourself. How many of your 4-year degree college classes do you actually use day to day? Right. For me, it's maybe 1 out of 30. I don't know. But, if we're being honest, the reality is that technology changes faster than a 4-year degree program can keep up with. One of the easiest things you can do to have access to a broader, more diverse pipeline is acknowledge this and start looking at alternative sources for recruits. Some of my favorites are using boot camps. Additionally, colleges are now moving more toward continuing education programs that are, relatively speaking, more diverse than their 4-year degree program. So think about alternative pathways into tech. Second is apprenticeship programs. Offer folks, rather than going through the whole bootcamp alternative education route, just apprentice people directly within your company. And the third, which is more of a COVID related change, is if you're not thinking about remote as a mechanism for, well, maybe you're still in shock. Everyone's still in shock because there's a lot going on in the world. But post shock, think about remote offices because one of the most obvious systemic problems that we have with respect to getting diverse pipelines is that talent is geographically distributed, but the opportunities are not. So now that we have an opportunity to think about remote work, this means that you can build teams that come from anywhere in the U.S. or time zone based, and start looking into other regions for your talent. So at Twitter, one of the first things that I did when I got here was beef up the Atlanta office. We're actually looking at international expansion and so on and so forth. But main thing, take away, if you can take anything remotely good out of what's happening with COVID, at least take away the fact that we have a new opportunity to access workers anywhere on the planet.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask was, one is, you mentioned holding leaders accountable for kind of really building out this diverse team. But as we go through interview, there's a lot of obviously biases that people tend to gravitate towards. So how do interview vet, as people tend to hire people like themselves? and also kind of connecting that with the Q&A on the Q&A tab. What are some of the good metrics to track that we're on the right path that we can use on the recruiting, but also for like the leaders?
Yeah, so you're saying metrics plus, just in terms of how we bring people through interview panels, what can we do to make sure those are fair? So for metrics, I think, this is pretty straightforward. I hope this isn't controversial, but like we've been reporting, we know what the numbers are. The numbers just aren't moving. So I think so it's not so much defining the metrics. So at Twitter we have a goal. I don't know if this has been published externally, but I'll just say it. And if I get in trouble, it'll be for the right reasons. But it's 50%, women in tech, and we're aiming for 10% Black Latinx, and I'm hoping to exceed that. But those are talked about numbers that are tied to my performance targets. All right. So the thing I'm saying is not just have metrics, but hold people accountable to metrics. Like that's the thing that I see missing. Like usually it's like have metrics, put them in a diversity report that, I won't even look, we'll keep this positive. There's enough negativity in the world, but like diversity reports tend to not be tied to accountability. And that's what I'm suggesting here. Like try and hold people accountable to moving the metrics. In terms of like, your question about how do we optimize interviews and make sure that we don't bring people who look like us. There's three things I would say I've seen work pretty well here. You want to eliminate interviewer bias. There's a couple different ways to do that. The easiest one, which just should, I don't know why people haven't done this before, but standardized interview rubrics. So get your engineers and maybe your HR team together, define commonly used questions so that everyone's getting the same look across the interview day. I know when I started my career, it was like everyone could just define their own questions, and in retrospect, that was probably a bad idea. Like that, but when I started my career, that was kind of the norm. I think we're moving to a world where it's more standardized rubrics to make it fair. Second is interview panels that contain people from outside the local team. I've seen that work really well. And in some cases, actually including folks who aren't even engineers. Like I've been at companies where it's like, hey, can we bring in someone from maybe sales or marketing to get a I don't want to say non-technical, but someone outside the R&D function to come in and get a look at this person as well. And you get another outside perspective on whether or not that person will be a good team player, has the right soft skills, et cetera. And then one thing I'm starting to see emerge, I'm willing to take a bet that this is a good idea, but I can also argue that there's other approaches that might be as effective. But diverse slates. So making sure that, for every N candidates that you interview, you ensure that there's the right mix of diversity on the interview candidate slate. The only question I have about this approach is that it might be there should be as much focus on top of funnel as well. So like at the very highest levels of your funnel, before people are even getting down into the interview panels, that you've also got metrics being tracked at that level is what I would add on. I haven't seen a lot of companies really taking it from that approach yet, but maybe we'll get there someday.
Yeah, I think there was a great book on how to do the interviews right that came out of Google HR. And I think the two things that had a highest correlation to the actual outcome and performance was one was structured interview, like the one you mentioned before. How do you create a structure around the interview so that everyone's asking a very, very similar way that has a lot of repeatability? And the other was like a project. You work on a project together within a given period of time. So really kind of those two factors are the only that were like kind of meaningful, had a statistical meaning to the actual performance of the people once they're on board.
Yeah.
Kind of other interesting question that was to pop up in the Q&A section is that diversity actually breeds diversity. So how are we building a diverse leadership team? And then just before even get to the answer, some of the context around, and we've done a lot of executive recruiting at Semper too, is a pool of candidates tend to become really, really narrow and small once you get to certain specific roles and titles. Yeah. So we'll have to kind of figure out how do we balance that.
Yeah. So you asked two really different questions there. Let me hit the exec one, because this is something that really concerns me as well. So I went most of my, all of my Microsoft career without seeing another black tech exec. And it wasn't until I moved to San Francisco that I started to see a few, but there's not a lot. So I do think a lot about not just how we get folks in the door at entry level and support them, but around mid-career or late stage career, what do we do to get folks into exec level positions? There's just a couple quick thoughts here for people in the audience who care about this. Equitable access to high potential programs. Just think about it for a second. Most like I was in a hypo program at Microsoft. They have the similar things at Facebook and Google and so forth. Think about all the hoops that an underrepresented person has to jump through before they get access to your executive hypo program. You can make that a lot more equitable. Secondarily, there are you can give underrepresented folks access to similar exec training courses outside of a formal hypo program. I've done that a few times. Stanford is nearby here. Berkeley has some great programs as well. Use your I&D budget directly to solve that problem. It is like the most straightforward thing you can do. And then finally, in terms of exec recruiting, access, like one of the biggest challenges for underrepresented folks who are in mid or late career is even knowing who to talk to. They just don't have the same access to networks. So sharing access to other executive leaders at your company, like through formal mentoring or sponsoring, or hell, just like coffee meetup programs. And then also for people unaware of it, access to external executive recruiting firms, like Diversa is one of my favorite ones. But just make your top talent aware that these things exist. In some cases, it may not be specifically the best thing to do for your particular company. Like if I go to underrepresented folks on my team and tell them that, oh, did you know executive recruiting firms exist? It's probably not optimal for my local company, but it's optimal for the world. It's like the right thing to do. Yeah. So just think about that. Sorry, hey, John, I forgot the first half of your question. You got me off on a long rant about.
There was more about the comment around like why the structured interviews work and the project-based things. To have the highest correlation to the actual performance.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing about having the structured approach or project approach is that over time it gets all your interviewers speaking the same language, and you're comparing people off the same sort of baseline performance. The biggest challenge with that is more coming up with the rubrics and questions. Like every place I've worked with that has done this, it's like, should we have different questions for back-end folks, senior versus junior back-end folks, front-end team, ML, et cetera. So you have to spend a little bit of time up front to get everyone to agree what the standard questions are. But once you do that, you end up gaining a ton of efficiencies on the back end, and you get the benefit of removing bias, systemic bias in that part of the interview process.
Yeah. And I guess switching gears a little bit, because we also want to kind of touch on this subject of high performance that comes from diverse teams. So I think because of COVID now, more companies are taking kind of the digital first or remote first approach. And according to some surveys found online, majority of startups are kind of expecting to go hybrid after everything on COVID is over. So what are some strategies and tactics that startups or any company can deploy to keep the product and the engineering team to perform well under this new mode of operation?
Yeah, this is really interesting because we're all kind of learning it in real time. And I've been surprised by a few things that have happened to the workforce during COVID. I think the key sort of insight here, before I get into that, the biggest challenge right now, before we do anything else, is mental health and childcare. All right. So before I talk about anything that we might take away from remote work and so forth, the biggest challenges we have right now are just trying to ensure that people who have kids, it's like almost, I'm surprised. I was on a call yesterday. My niece was doing PE in the next room and making too much noise. So I had to go ask her to stop, jumping jacking so hard. So dealing with that, I think, is a problem. And then dealing with the mental health of isolation. Just make sure that you're allowing people to have access to internal benefits resources to get them the help that they need. So step one. But step two, one thing that I'm also seeing is as people have adopted collaboration technologies like Zoom and so on and so forth, I am seeing equal or greater productivity within certain functions, like engineering, like the lack of walking between meeting rooms, the lack of a commute is fundamentally adding more time to people's day that they can use to be productive. So I don't think we're losing productivity. I think the risk here is like people are burning themselves out. And like as a as a leader, it's like I would just encourage you to, if you're seeing the same sort of thing, like carve out time and just tell people like either it's going to be no meetings, or at Twitter, one thing that's slowly starting to emerge, it's like every second week we seem to be getting like a day of rest, which for me has been insanely helpful. Because I like everyone else am in this same sort of back to back nonstop meeting mode, and I just need a little bit of time to reset from all the context switching. So I don't think we're going to see a productivity loss. I think people are, once childcare and all sorts of other societal sorts of challenges sort of work themselves out, I think we're going to retain a lot of desire to at least have hybrid. If not, like we have to think very carefully about how to convince people to come back to the office. It could be like the on-site is the new off-site or something like that. Or the free breakfast will be even better. I mean, I don't know what it's going to take, but I think for a certain class of workers, they'll want to stay home. The other thing for startups, I think, to recognize here is COVID's accelerating, separate from the workforce, but if you're a startup, it's going to accelerate several macro trends. I was surprised back at Looker. I was at Looker when this shift started to occur, but we started to see like banking companies who were accelerating their on-prem to cloud transformation because, hey, it's real hard to manage data centers when everyone has COVID and you can't actually get into the physical building. Like this changes people's behaviors in real ways. And then the other thing I would look at is hyper collaboration software. Zoom is the obvious example, but think about Figma or any other productivity tool, or with the assumption that it will be based around teams working together in real time. I think this is a big macro shift that we have to be aware of, not just from a buyer perspective, like we're buying tools, but if you're a startup coming up with like the next big thing and it doesn't include the idea of hyper collaboration, you should revisit and take restock. So.
Yeah. Oh. Great. And then speaking of kind of a remote working, one thing that we've seen more, we've been noticing more of is startups are being built and run outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. I mean, we went through Y Combinator. The majority of the companies nowadays are seeing R&D done in India, China, Ukraine, anywhere around the world. So so this introduced more variables, managing teams across the different geos, time zones, culture, even languages. And seems like the range of diversity is getting broader and more complex. So what are the things to look out for when you're kind of building and running teams in this kind of ever diverging environment?
So and by the way, I love this problem. I think everyone should be excited that this is a quote unquote problem. Like, oh, I get access to talent around the planet. But yeah, it does introduce some challenges. I think the most fundamental one is like, as you structure teams, this is sort of obvious, but like if people aren't going into specific offices, which is how you used to orient teams, like, oh, we'll have the SF office or, the New York office. If people aren't in physical offices, you now have the ability to orient around maybe time zones or regions. So we're starting to see that shift. You should just do that now. Like assume people are going to want to work remote and like remove specific office locations from your job postings and then reorient them to either a regional strategy or time zones based strategies. This is just a practical thing to do right now to get ahead of this. Don't wait. Now, one challenge you'll see, or anyone who has run teams in different cities or different countries, is there's very different. There's the coordination challenges, which I'll set aside. I think you guys all know that it's difficult to coordinate across multiple time zones. I'm going to skip that and go to cultural differences. So, in a world where you've got your teams maybe on the West Coast versus the South, or, in the US versus, Israel or the UK, one of the biggest challenges is that each of these countries has its own culture. And you as a leader have to find a way to articulate what values matter across all of these cultures. Like, you're going to have to make trade-offs. So what are the things you aren't going to trade off? And that tends to be result in a very, very focused sort of articulation of what matters to your company, the way that you execute, or what have you. But you've got to get it really crisp if you're going to be communicating it across a bunch of different regions. What are the expected work hours? How do you manage conflict? How do you lead and execute? I remember when I got my first team in Israel, this was sort of when I learned about this difference, because I was like in the US, we have very, I would say, more, you can be sort of top down and you can kind of dive in and like tell people specifically what to do. And I was in that mode. And then when I got my first team in Israel, all of these folks have mandatory conscription. So they've all been in the military. And in that dynamic, they're used to taking orders, interpreting them, and then, figuring out the details themselves. So if you come in and try and, poke at the details, culturally that's like a mismatch. And it took me a little bit of time to figure that out. Same thing when I had a team in Sweden once. You have to give them feedback in a different way. Sweden's known for its attention to detail. So if you you don't deliver your feedback in the right way, you might be misperceived. So, a great resource for figuring this out. I looked up a few things to share with you guys. Paul Sohn has a really cool and funny sort of set of infographics. If you search for charts of leadership styles by Paul Sohn, he sort of visualized the differences in different cultural leadership styles. And then if you're more in the mood to pay someone money to get all this info, there's a product called GlobeSmart, which it's actually pretty cool and intimidating, because it just throws all this info at you at once. So so what it does is it looks at cultural dimensions of cultural difference. I think there's like 15 of them. Culture's respect for inclusion, diversity, their communication style, their execution style, leadership style. It's like all these different dimensions across every country on earth. Mm-hmm. And you can take a survey to see your own personal preference, and it will tell you the difference between your personal working style and any sort of environment that you might go into. And then it also gives you specific cultural insights. Like if you need to work with a team in Japan, I remember for me, this was like super difficult. I went to Japan and I was trying to figure out, they've got this little dance you got to do with business cards. This took me forever to wrap my head around, but this website, GlobeSmart, actually walks you through the mechanics of how you do each of these sorts of culture-specific greetings and so forth and so on. So check that out. It's a cool tool.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, we're almost at time, but one thing that I did notice was we have about 7 different offices around the world, and the cultural difference is one of the big topics that we consistently talk about. Just really trying to help people understand how to collaborate across different culture. So thank you for touching on this topic. And I guess we have about a minute left in our session. So one final question is like, what is your take on the so-called cultural fit? Now we've talked about it. Some people say cultural additive. Some people say cultural fit, alignment. What's your quick take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that culture fit, as people interpret it, there's a good version of that and a bad version of that. And I'm obviously going to tell you the good version. The bad version of this, which I think historically it was culture fit meant was like, is this person cool to hang out with, right? And the culture fit interview would be like, I guess take someone to a bar and see if they'll do shots with you, right? That's the bad version of the culture fit interview, in case it wasn't obvious. That will not fly in 2020. Now, there's a better version of this, which is more focused on your company's mission and values, right? And I guarantee you that if you can get people who care about your company's mission and overall value statement, and you can provide them with opportunities that intersect with their professional development needs, that you will get what's like called the blue flame, like the person's personal goals and the business goals intersect in a fantastic way. For me at Twitter, like one of the reasons I work here and not any other place on earth is I very strongly believe in Twitter's mission to serve the public conversation. I mean, every week almost there is another thing happening in the world. And Twitter is the way in which the world sort of understands and processes news happening around the planet. And being a part of the team that makes that platform for communication safely available to the earth, to me, is a super important mission. So my work and so on is multiplied by the fact that I'm really bought in. So culture fit, to me, I would reorient it toward that. Like, if you can find good mission overlap, I think that's what you want to go for.
Great. We're out of time. Thank you so much, and it's so excited to reconnect with you. And thank you for Plato for hosting us. Thanks
a ton. Really enjoyed the time, and great to see you again, John. Great to see all the folks in the audience. Thanks for coming to listen to me.
Great. Thank you, everyone.